Hi everyone, my name is Matt Palm. I'm the research coordinator for Mobilizing Justice, which is a nationwide multi-city, multi-agency partnership on advancing justice and equity in transportation planning across Canada. Today I'm actually going to talk a little bit about some work that was supported by an Exceed grant prior to Mobilizing Justice. And I'm going to start first by talking about answering this question of, does bus on-time performance in Toronto vary by socio-demographics? This was the original research question we had. In some ways, we know a lot more about accessibility of transit systems, but we do not know, with respect to equity, but we don't know quite as much about the performance of transit systems with respect to equity. And there's a dearth of research and methods out there on thinking about how to measure the equity of transit performance and transit operations, and also how that in turn impacts on people's well-being. So today I'll start by talking about the legal and philosophical origins of our research question, and then I'll move on to results from Toronto and how we tried to adapt what was a primarily US-based method to the Canadian experience. So the most established way of thinking about equity in operations actually comes from the United States. This approach is what we'll call old school for now, and by old school I mean it's because it originates from the original language of Title VI of the US Civil Rights Act. Title VI of the US Civil Rights Act states that no person in the US shall, on the grounds of race, color, or national origin, be excluded from participation in or be denied the benefits of or be subject to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. When that law was passed, all federal agencies were tasked with interpreting it. And so the US DOT and FTA adopted a very particular equity method that sought to identify and rectify any disparities in transit operations along lines of race. To put it another way, they weren't so much looking at the way in which, say, poor transit performance can affect well-being and people's ability to get where they need to go, to stay gainfully employed, to get to the doctor's office on time. What they were really interested in is making sure that whatever service quality more privileged communities had was at least what historically disadvantaged communities had as well. I'll be using the terms minority and non-minority throughout this conversation, in large part because that is the original language that exists in FTA's interpretation of the Civil Rights Act. And basically, the method it's very simple, it's very straightforward. A transit agency must classify all of their routes as either minority serving or non-minority serving, and then they must calculate performance statistics between these two groups of routes. Here's a semi-recent example from MTS. This is San Diego's transit system. And so this is their standard for operational performance, for on-time performance, I think departures. And then this is the average performance of their minority serving routes and their non-minority serving routes. As long as the gap between these two is no greater than, say, 5% or 10%, you're not in violation of the Civil Rights Act because there's no disparate or disproportional negative impact to minority routes. How do we define minority routes? This comes straight from US DOT. There are two approaches. The first is using census data, and this is probably one of the most common ones because the survey data is a bit more expensive. In this method, a route is considered minority serving if it's one where at least 1/3 of the revenue miles are in a block group where the percent minority population exceeds the percent minority population in the service area. So what you would do is you would map out all of your neighborhoods and you would identify those which had a higher non-white resident share than the service area as a whole. And if at least 1/3 of the revenue miles of a route pass through those neighborhoods, it's minority serving. The more sophisticated approach is to do an onboard survey, and quite a few of the larger transit agencies in the US do these episodically, precisely for Title VI compliance. And in that case, a route is considered minority serving if the percent of the ridership that is non-white is equal to or greater than the percent minority of the service area population. So first, as a kind of thought exercise, we applied both of these definitions to Toronto using Statistics Canada data and the Transport for Tomorrow survey. So we use the TTS data basically for the equivalent of a ridership-based definition, and that's panel B here on the bottom. Everything in yellow would be considered a minority serving route based on USDOT's definition. If we use census data, then panel A shows what would be considered a minority and a non-minority serving route, and then all neighborhoods that meet that definition from FTA of being a minority or non-white neighborhood are highlighted in dark gray. One of the things you'll note right away is these maps are very striking, and they illustrate David Holchansky, who's a social work professor at U of T, who talks about how in Toronto there really are three different cities that are demographically and socially polarized, particularly with respect to distance from the subway. And you can really see that in these maps and in these classifications. So routes serving the downtown core and the surrounding neighborhoods were more likely to not be considered minority serving, and the opposite was true for routes serving the inner suburbs or connecting inner suburbs from east to west. We took a look at how changing the data input for defining a minority serving route changed the definitions, and there were two big changes. According to census data, a lot of the routes that do not look like minority serving routes become minority serving routes when you shift from census to ridership data. Why? Because the night routes ridership is much more diverse than the neighborhoods that those routes are passing through, if that makes sense. And then on the flip side, a lot of routes that connect the downtown core to a lot of inner suburban neighborhoods are based on the census data minority serving, but the ridership of those routes is actually whiter than the residential neighborhoods that they serve. And so when you use a ridership-based definition, they become non-minority serving routes. So these are the ones that change, and I don't think either of those dynamics are particularly surprising, but we were trying to add to a conversation that's happening about when you're thinking about equity and you're defining impacted groups at the route level, the data you use can introduce a type of bias. So we looked at on-time performance for equity, and the reason is, of course, that for infrequent routes, on-time performance can matter. I'm not going to go into too much detail on that because I know that people have written dissertations on different transit performance metrics, and some of those folks are in the room and it's a bit beyond my expertise, but this is the metric we took for now. And we then basically duplicated the analysis for an FTA equity approach to Toronto. And the results are that when it comes to service quality, TTC is horizontally equitable. So for example, if we use the census-based definitions, non-minority routes are on average on time 71%. These are departures, I should say, on-time departures. And I'll say that they were weighted by revenue mile. We tried alternative weightings based on ridership. It didn't change the results all that much. So non-minority routes are on time 71% of the time, minority routes 74%. Whether we use a ridership classification, similarly, there isn't that big of a disparity. So, you know, one of the limitations of this method is that it relies on these aggregated statistics, right? So route level aggregations don't exactly cut across the many diverse demographic lines and identities of people. The US Civil Rights Act, which is the basis of this method, was responding to Jim Crow. And under a Jim Crow period, this method of lumping all minority and non-minority routes into two bins and running an average might make sense. because people were just coming out of a period of forced segregation in the United States. But for us in Toronto, and frankly, for people in most US cities as well, this distinction is overly simplistic. So as a second step to our analysis, we decided to jump from the route scale, which you're looking at now, and recalculate the results at the level of the individual. So what we did is we took all individuals who rode transit in the Transportation Tomorrow survey, and we assigned each of those riders in that household travel survey an on-time score based on the route and time of day of their trip. So if respondent X took the 96 bus in the AM period, they received the average on-time performance of the 96 bus during the AM period for that year, averaged across that year, which was 2016. If they took multiple buses, we averaged across all the buses they rode on the survey day. Then we could recompute the analysis at the level of the individual, and we could start to look at a whole lot of more variables besides just ethnicity. When we conduct this analysis, what you'll find again is there is no major disparity using FTA's definition of a disparity along racial lines. So this is the individual level distribution of how people from the TTS experience on-time performance. There are riders who experience 9% on time. There are riders that experience 100. And the medians, again, by race, very close. We also looked at carless households. But again, moving away from the traditional civil rights-based thinking and thinking more holistically about equity and inclusion, one of the things that this statistic here tells us is that a quarter of all visible minority riders in the city are using routes where on-time departures are between 9 and 61%. Similarly, these statistics here are telling us that a quarter of transit users in carless households are using routes where on-time departures vary between 20 and 56%. So going back to and sort of pushing a conversation around equity a bit broader, the more important question becomes, what threshold of on-time performance do we actually need to ensure that late buses do not hinder riders' well-being, right? For households that don't own vehicles, we might imagine that poor transit performance could have an outsized impact on well-being, on quality of life, on getting to work on time. And it may not even be that percent on time is even the most important stat that actually correlates with people showing up to work late or showing up to school late. So one of the things that we will be working on as part of Mobilizing Justice is thinking about, for our operational performance measures, are there thresholds below which there is significant negative cost to riders? Can we take data on bus on-time performance, layer it over something like school attendance data, and actually specify or quantify the relationship between local bus on-time performance and the percent of kids who show up to school late? From an analysis like that, can we then take it a step further and derive a standard below which we do not want those routes to go? The added benefit of this analysis is that we can go to premiers, MPs, MPPs, whoever, and explain in very specific empirical terms the social and economic costs to people's lives and to people's well-being of late transit vehicles, something we're actually in the process of doing right now. So in conclusion, TTC's on-time performance is horizontally equitable. However, we note that a significant number of carless riders in the city are relying on routes with low on-time performance. And while all Canadian riders know the costs of a late bus, I mean, I'm sure the tweets that many of you are analyzing go into some detail about the costs people are experiencing. I love this one. There was a student who was almost late to her exam and everybody came through, right? But we have yet to translate performance metrics into those quantified impacts that in turn we can go back to policymakers and use to push for better transit for people's well-being, for making a city that is just and inclusive for all. I just want to end by thanking the University of Toronto Exceed Grant for supporting this work. This was the publication that this presentation is based on. Feel free to email me if you'd like a free copy, and if you want to know more, please visit mobilizingjustice.ca.
Thank you, Matt, so much for your thoughts and interest for the work you've been doing. There's one, I think, a couple of questions. Steve already answered one. One question is whether non-surface routes, subway and rapid transit have been included.
Subway and rapid transit were not included in this study. It was just buses.
Thank you.
And to answer Raphael's question, we looked at the rider's home DA and assigned a basically percent or probability that they were visible minority based on the DA statistics. So it's imprecise, but yeah.
Good. Thank you. We have time for more questions. So another question in the chat, are you considering other operational metrics like speed passengers receive or others?
I haven't thought about that, but I think, you know, there are definitely, that's an open question of, you know, which of these many performance metrics matter from that justice lens is something to investigate, but that's a good question. Thank you.